Hey, what's going on, guys? Kalamazi here. This is going to be my 9.0 Shadowlands Destruction Warlock DPS guide. In it, we're going to be covering Mythic Plus talents, rating talents, Covenants, Soulbinds, Conduits, Legendaries, single target rotations, AoE rotations, basically everything that you need to know to play a Destruction Warlock. Now, any Week Wars profiles or add-ons you see here, you can grab for free off my Twitch. Feel free to swing by, drop a follow, hang out, ask any questions anytime. So, with all that being said, let's start off with some of the changes that Destruction Warlock got in Shadowlands, and then get into different talent builds. Starting off with changes to Destruction Warlock in Shadowlands, similar to Affliction and what you'll see as Demonology, the generic changes are pretty much the same. Curse of Exhaustion, Tongues, and Weakness are back, I suppose, from Classic or I guess early WoW era. Same application, same utility for the most part. Demonic Circle has gone baseline. It is no longer a talent. It has been replaced with Howl of Terror, which is awesome. Love the ability. Super happy to see it back. The final generic ability here is Spell Domination. It makes your next pet summon 5.5 seconds faster. Basically instant cast. It's like 0.4-ish seconds depending on your haste. And it also costs 0 soul shards. This is actually pretty nice because at times in combat, if your pet dies or for whatever reason, if you're trying to get your pet out fast, obviously, hey, Spell Dom is nice to have around, and the reduced shard cost is useful in a lot of settings. Getting into actual Destro's main toolkit, Havoc's duration has been increased from 10 seconds to 12. So it might not seem like a lot, but that's actually a pretty big increase. For the most part, as long as your sequencing and Havoc setup is proper, you can get in 3 Chaos Bolts pretty easily, which is a substantial increase to where we've been in, well, basically for a lot of Destro's history, BFA, Legion before. The actual duration increase is very relevant. Rain of Fire was buffed a bit damage-wise, but for the most part, besides that, everything is pretty much the same here as far as the core toolkit goes. Talent-wise, however, Soulfire has been reworked. It now burns enemy soul, dealing fire damage and applying Immolate. It also generates 1 soul shard on a 45-second cooldown. This ability can indeed be cast with Havoc. It will give you 2 shards back. It'll apply Immolate to both targets. However, it is not affected by Backdraft. As far as this row goes here, Shadowburn's back, or I guess altered in a sense. It has 2 charges. It's not, at this current point in time, we'll get to it in a little bit here, talent-wise as well. It's probably not going to see a whole lot of play in its current form. I just wish it was baseline, but that's a story for, well, another time. Fire and Brimstone has had its shard generation, I guess, fragments increased. However, the actual damage reduction to the incinerates that it spreads whenever you cast them is just too much. This talent, unfortunately, is not really where you want to be. However, the shard generation part has indeed been increased. They nerf the damage of the nerf like Cataclysm's impacts cast damage. However, it does still apply Immolate to all enemies. It is not target capped or anything of the sort. 40 row here once again. Howl of Terror has, I guess, been swapped for Demonic Circle. This is an ability that I used for a while in like BC, even in Wrath for the most part, as long as I remember correctly. It's cool to see it back. For the most part, we'll get to it in a minute here again. I don't think it's going to see like a whole lot of play, at least in PvE, but it's cool to have back nonetheless. The big changes, however, lie in the 45 row. So Roaring Blaze now essentially alters your conflict rate to now give a damage increase for 8 seconds. Basically an increase to your fire spells. It was initially just fire spells, but now it's like Immolate. It says every single spell that it affects. Immolate, Incinerate, Conflict Rate. If I swap Channel Demon Fire here, for example, it will now say Channel Demon Fire. This does not increase Chaos Bolt. It does not increase Cataclysm. It does not increase Rain of Fire. Yes, technically Chaos Bolt is fire damage. It's Shadow Flame damage, but it's basically a whitelist and blacklist kind of thing, which is why they've just gone to telling you exactly what spells. Channel Demon Fire, Immolate, Incinerate, and Conflict Rate. So this is, in my opinion, a great change for this ability, because the previous version of Roaring Blaze was a complete nightmare. To a similar extent, Reign of Chaos has replaced Grimoire of Supremacy. It says while your initial Infernal is active, every soul shard you spend has a 15% chance to summon an additional Infernal that lasts 8 seconds. So this means that if you're playing Reign of Chaos and you drop your Infernal, each soul shard you spend, being 3 here, like on a Rain of Fire, for example, has a chance to summon another Infernal. Now, I have terrible luck, bad RNG, I didn't proc one. But this can get out of hand pretty quickly with spawning more Infernals early on into your Reign of Chaos window. That means more shard generation, because they generate the same amount of resources as your main one does here. So more Infernals early on means more down the line. More shards rolling early. It's a solid ability, but we'll get some more of that in a little bit here. Grimoire Sacrifice is buffed, damage-wise, not good, don't play it. 50 row, Soul Conduit, Channel Demon Fire, or Dark Soul Instability. Now, for the most part, we've taken Dark Soul over the course of BFA and things, but a lot of that had to do with Grimoire Supremacy and having that, you know, max critical strike chance at the very end of your Grimoire Supremacy window for max Chaos Bolt value. That's gone now. You have Random Chaos. This is still a strong talent, but there are also other options here like CDF, which, well, did gain a bit of value. And Soul Conduit is still Soul Conduit. With that being said, let's get into the actual talent breakdown for single target fights and then Mythic Plus AoE. So if you're looking at single target talents for Destruction Warlocks in Shadowlands, the 15 row here, you have Flashover, Eradication, and Soulfire. Flashover, I feel, is going to end up being a talent we play the majority of the time. Eradication, while it is a strong effect, with it being such a short, like the very first part of the expansion, with haste and secondary stats being lower, having an extra charge of Backdraft is just solid. Also, the conflict rate damage increase works well with Roaring Blaze if you're playing a build like that, because, hey, Roaring Blaze increases conflict rate damage. Conflict rate is fire damage, and this also increases conflict rate damage by 25%. So there's a bit of added value of Flash over here comparatively to BFA. Eradication is not bad, and I will say that Soulfire, it's sort of a sim thing. To a similar extent, Eradication and Total Combustion, like, for example, simmed very well in BFA, even early on, before, like, Corruption and things became a thing. They gained a lot more value when you had Expedient and things like that. But even though they simmed better, they weren't ahead by a lot. It was a very narrow margin, and Flashover Entropy gameplay was just better. It felt smoother, it felt more rewarding, and those were the talents people ended up playing for the most part. So I will say that there's a bit of merit to Soulfire with the single target build with Roaring Blaze, because once again, Roaring Blaze does indeed affect Soulfire, but we're going to have to wait and see how that shakes out. For the most part, I feel that Flashover is going to be the choice single target wise in the 15 row. 25 row, Entropy and Total Combustion, Shadowburn. To a similar extent, once again, even if Internal Combustion sims a tiny bit better than Reverse Entropy, which I don't really believe it does now, Internal Combustion scales with haste. Immolate ticks faster. Internal Combustion is based off of your immolate damage. It consumes a duration of your immolate when your Chaos Bolt hits the target. So with low levels of haste, Internal Combustion feels really bad and performs really poorly. The change they should have made here is just to make it scale with intellect or something like that, but hey, they didn't, they didn't. So 25 row, personally, I feel Reverse Entropy is going to be where you want to be. 30 row, up to you, personal preference. Burning Rush here, the majority of the time is going to win just because of, well, it being an insane amount of mobility on a very little. 50% movement speed is big, and yes, it costs a bit of life, but for the most part in raiding and Mythic Plus, it shouldn't really matter. And if you're low on life, or a lot of damage is coming at you pretty quickly, you just turn it off. It's a very big increase in basically every scenario. 35 row, Inferno, Fire and Brimstone, Cataclysm. The only single target ability we have here is Cataclysm, and it's not bad. You're going to be casting this on cooldown. It does apply Immolate even outside of your Pandemic window. You still want to cast Cataclysm on cooldown. De facto choice here, single target, is Cata. 40 row, Dark Fury, Coil, Howl of Terror. I think for the most part, unless you're in a setting where Dark Fury or Howl ends up being really good for whatever reason, you're going to want to play with Mortal Coil. A 45-second cooldown with a 20% heal is really strong. Between this, Healthstone, Health Pot, Kyrian Health Pot, Unending Resolve, Drain Life, you have a lot of ways to heal yourself. Now, previously, like I mentioned, Demonic Circle was actually in place of Howl of Terror, so it puts you in an awkward spot, basically meaning, am I taking Demonic Circle for PvE things or just whatever, or Mortal Coil? And normally the choice was Demonic Circle. Now you don't have that choice. Coil, I feel, is the de facto play in the 40 row. 45 row, single target wise, you really have two options being Reign of Chaos and Roaring Blaze. However, I feel that Roaring Blaze pulls ahead. We'll get to legendaries in a few minutes here, but I will say this effect here with the legendary that gives you 3 charges of conflict rate and not 2 is exceptionally strong, because that legendary also reduces the cooldown. I guess it reduces your cooldown of conflict rate by 3 seconds baseline, and conflict rate's cooldown is further affected by haste. So giving you 3 charges on essentially an 8 or 7.5 second cooldown with an 8-second duration of Roaring Blaze means, for the most part, you can have a pretty high uptime, almost 100%, depending on how you play it. If you're clipping your conflict rates, thus clipping the actual buff and refreshing, or waiting for it to fall. Roaring Blaze, I feel personally, is the choice in the 45 row for single target. To a similar extent, The only ability we have here that's affected by Roaring Blaze is Channel Demon Fire. Now, once again, like I said before, Dark Soul is still a strong option. It's just that you lost the stacking damage that Grimoire Supremacy had with Dark Soul leaked deep into your Inferno windows, and VOP is thankfully also gone, unless you consider this VOP, but hey, we're not playing that right now. Soul Conduit is not terrible, neither is Dark Soul, but my choice here personally is Channel Demon Fire. I enjoy playing with CDF a whole lot in Legion, and I'm happy to see it back. Once again, Roaring Blaze does also affect Channel Demon Fire, so the single target build of Destro, I will say right now, the Chaos Bolt does not hit as hard as it probably should. It should hit harder. It needs a buff, but this build is more or less focused around like Immolate, Incinerate, Channel Demon Fire, conflict rate damage with Roaring Blaze. And like I said, the triple conflict legendary makes this build very strong and a solid contender in single target fights in Shadowlands. Now, if you're looking at AoE talents for destruction in Shadowlands, the build becomes even more, I guess, easier to decipher. It's more cookie cutter, I suppose, than the single target build. 15 row, flashover, eradication, and soulfire just don't really offer a whole lot in heavy AoE. A second charge of backdraft and increased conflict damage is where you want to be. 25 row, once again, entropy, internal combustion, shadow burn. Entropy is the play. Internal combustion is a single target or two target ability if you're in a havoc window. There is a bit of merit, I suppose, to shadow burn at times, like in Mythic Plus or as are dying frequently, but I just still don't think it's where it needs to be. If it was a baseline ability, you would use it quite often. Havoc, Shadowburn Shards, I think, was a very big part of Destro's toolkit in previous expansions. For some reason, they want to keep it a talent, and, well, that's that. So, flashover into Entropy. 30 row, Burning Rush. 35 row, Inferno, Fire and Brimstone, Cataclysm. Now, I will say here, there are two builds I want to reference a bit here, but for the most part, being the larger, like more CD-centric Reign of Chaos build, you take Inferno. Which we'll get to in a minute, but Reign of Chaos gives you a lot more shard generation with your Infernal being down, more Reign of Fire cast, and hey, a buff to Reign of Fire's damage. Inferno, you see what we're getting at here. Inferno is going to be the de facto play in the heavy AoE build. 40 row, Fury, Coil, Howl, Coil. 45 row. So this is where you start seeing a bit of changes. Reign of Chaos is hands down one of the strongest AoE profiles I feel sustainable AoE profiles in the game at this point. The issue with Reign of Chaos is that it's tied to your main Infernal cooldown. You'll see the actual buff right here. Now, that might not seem like a bad thing necessarily. You have insane damage when you have your Infernal down, but the problem with Destro, I feel, is that you don't have much damage outside of your Infernal. Now, we'll get to Legendaries in a minute. I'll show one now because it just, this Legendary holds this build together. Wilfred's Sigil of Superior Summoning. This build really holds this version of Destro together, because when you're in your Reign of Chaos window, the more Infernals you spawn, the more shards you get, the more Reign of Fire cast you get, the more shards you're spending, so it reduces your Infernal cooldown even more, faster and faster. The thing with this build, though, is that you essentially have to be in combat to spend more shards, to generate more resources. And if you're in a lower key setting, or if you don't get max value out of your Inferno window, which is 30 seconds, you don't get max value out of your Infernal reduction from Wilfred. So this talent here is very powerful, but outside of your Reign of Chaos window, you just don't do much damage. You don't have Cataclysm to manually apply Immolates. You don't have, just any other real great AoE CDs. You have Reign of Fire, but it's nowhere near as impactful, dropping 1 or 2 Reign of Fires every 6 seconds compared to 10 in a Reign of Chaos window towards the end. It's pretty insane. Even with that being said, Reign of Chaos is still hands on the pick here when it comes to Mythic Plus or AoE. It's too hard to try and spread Roaring Blaze with Havoc, with or without it, and Plus it's just not worth it. Reign of Chaos is indeed the choice here in the 45 row. In the 50 row, you have the option of Soul Conduit, Channel Demon Fire, or Dark Soul Instability. Soul Conduit, I feel, is the de facto choice with the Reign of Chaos Inferno build. Once again, a chance to refund shards, which means even more Reign of Fire cast, even more Wilfred's, I guess, cooldown reductions, even more Reign of Chaos procs. This cooldown profile is so incredibly strong, it sort of reminds me of Unholy Decays in Mythic Plus in BFA at times. If your tank pulls around your Infernal, your damage is truly, truly insane. You have one of the best damage profiles in the game. One of the issues with that profile, though, is that it is a 30-second cooldown. I don't think a pack is living through, a full half a minute of 8 Infernals and 15 Reign of Fire cast. Either way, though, if your tank is pulling around your cooldowns, it is certainly a very, very strong build. So this is the first build for Mythic Plus and AoE. I will say the build I've been testing with a bit more on beta towards the end for more of a middle ground kind of feel. Actually shifts away from Inferno and goes Cataclysm and channel Demon Fire with Reign of Chaos. Now, what this build gets you is essentially Cata being half a minute cooldown. So basically every pack, when you run in, you can just Cataclysm and then go right into a channel Demon Fire, because Cata applies Immolate, and channel Demon Fire hits your target, I guess your main target. It's affected by Immolate, and then AoEs on the smaller targets or side targets around that one. So it gives you a more front-loaded damage profile, but not as big of one when you have your Infernal. You're still playing Reign of Chaos, but you're not playing Soul Conduit. You're not playing Inferno for more Reign of Fire damage. You'll probably start into playing Wilfrids with this build, but this gives you more of a front-loaded, a more, I guess you can say, what's the word I'm looking for here? A more universal damage build. You're not so CD centric, and you actually do damage outside your Infernal, which is the main complaint of most Destro locks playing this build. I think in higher keys or more organized keys, you're going to want to play this build here. But if you're looking at like mid-tier keys or early level dungeons, whatever, I think Cata CDF is a very, very solid alternative, and it's probably flown under the radar for a lot of, with Reign of Chaos obviously, for a lot of beta. So 2 builds here: Flash over Entropy, Cata, Reign of Chaos, channel Demon Fire, or Flash over Entropy, Inferno, Reign of Chaos, Soul Conduit. Getting into Legendaries for Destruction here, there are 2 that really stick out. Well, I suppose 2 to 3-ish that really stick out as powerhouses for the 2 builds we talked about. The number 1 powerhouse, or one of the few, being Cinders of Azakir. Conflagrate has 1 additional charge and has its recharge time reduced by 3 seconds. This is from Sludgefist in the raid. This is very, very powerful, as mentioned, with the Roaring Blaze Destruction talent, meaning that you have essentially a 1 more charge for 8 more seconds of uptime. And the fact that this also reduces the cooldown of Conflagrate by 3 seconds, right now I have it at 11 seconds. It'd be 8 seconds baseline. How long is Roaring Blaze's duration? 8 seconds. How many charges do you have? 3. So basically this gives you a permanent uptime on Roaring Blaze, which is really, really solid. Now, there are currently 2 different schools of thought with Roaring Blaze and Conflagrate here. One is clipping, similar to how you do Cascading Calamity and BFA, every Roaring Blaze Conflagrate buff, because Roaring Blaze increases Conflagrate's damage, and so does Flashover, which means that if you clip it right at the very end, it'll buff the Conflagrate you're casting damage-wise. I personally think that school of thought is better, but if you wait for it to drop and then reconflagrate, depending on your haste levels, you will have a bit of a higher uptime on Roaring Blaze, but I think the first way of doing it is better. Regardless, Cinders is a very, very, very strong single target and 2 target legendary for Destro, because you can Havoc things. And once again, remember, Havoc's duration was increased from 10 seconds to 12, which means you can technically Roaring Blaze 2 targets and conflagrate again and again, and have Roaring Blaze active on both them for a very long time. Remember also, Havoc essentially doubles your shard generation off of like Conflagrate, Incinerate, whatever spell you're casting. So this legendary is very strong, and certainly the one I'm looking at for single target damage, and even 2 target cleave fights, something maybe like Huntsman Altimore in Castle Nathria. It's a very, very strong legendary, and certainly one that I have my eye on. Odor's this thing, the legendary cloak from Legion. Enemies marked by your Havoc take 25% increased damage from your single target spells. Now, this means you can indeed, for whatever reason, wear this legendary and put Havoc on 1 target if you're like on a single target boss, and you will indeed deal 25% increased damage to that target. Now, I think there are better legendaries for that, like, maybe Madness or Cinders or, I don't know, Synergy. But that technically can be done if you're wondering. The strength of this legendary, however, lies in big 2 target cleave fights, basically where you're going to have 2 targets active every time your Havoc is off cooldown for a significant damage increase on your second priority Havoc target. It's pretty cut and dry. In the end, honestly, I think Cinders very well might just end up beating us out in the first place if you're playing Roaring Blaze in the fight, but it's one to keep in mind. Madness of Azakir increases Chaos Bolt's damage and reduces the cast time by 20 for 3 seconds. This is an old tier bonus. It's okay. It's not great. If we ever end up wearing 2 legendaries at once, this might start seeing play then. I think there are just better options out there. It's not really very high on my list of legendaries at this point for Destruction. Embers of the Diabolic Raiment. Incinerate now generates 100% additional soul shard fragments. So this does work with Fire and Brimstone. It gives you an insane amount of shards with F and B. But the thing is, if you're playing this in AoE, you should probably be playing Wilfrids or Synergy anyways, And if you're trying to play this in single target, you should probably be playing Cinders or probably Madness or Synergy anyways. It's just a weird effect. Some of these sort of feel like tier bonuses and some feel legendary. These sort of feel like tier bonuses to me. These more or less feel legendary. So moving on from the 4 Destro ones here, Wilfred's Sigil. Every soul shard you spend reduces the cooldown of Summon Infernal by 1.5 seconds. Rain of Fire costs 3 shards. Chaos Bolt costs 2 shards. So this is not a direct replacement for Vision of Perfection like we had in BFA. However, it gets relatively close. And in like heavy AoE settings with Reign of Chaos and permanent multiple targets, like for example, Stone Legion Generals in Castle Nathria, this leads to sub 2-minute Infernals. This has been nerfed a few times. However, it's still a very strong effect, and Destruction is the best spec for Wilfred's Sigil, hands down. This is the legendary that you play with this build in Mythic Plus. Soul Conduit, Reign of Chaos, Inferno, Flash over Entropy. Once again, sub 2-minute Infernals. And when most of your damage is based around your Infernal with Reign of Chaos and things, you can see where this is going. This is a very, very strong legendary for the AoE version of Destruction. It's not terrible for the more single target one because, I mean, hey, a 2-minute 10-second Infernal or so is still not bad, but you gain more value playing this build in Mythic Plus and AoE. The last one I want to talk about here, I guess for Warlock based ones, is Relic of Demonic Synergy. These aren't very good. Demonic Synergy, so damage done by you or your primary demon has a chance to increase the, or I guess grant the other one 10% increased damage for 15 seconds. So if your pet procs this effect, you get the 10% damage increase for 15 seconds. If you proc the effect, your pet gets it for 15 seconds. Now, this is 3 ppm per minute for you and 3 for your pet. This legendary has a very high uptime, and as far as like a middle ground legendary goes, both this and Wilfred's are in a pretty good spot. Like for Destro, if you're looking at like one for just, you know, one universal one for raiding and Mythic Plus all around, Wilfred's and Relic are both very good. A 10% increase is solid depending where you get the proc. It has a pretty high uptime. We were averaging like 50-ish% uptime in dungeons we were running with this on us, not even including our pet. It's not bad. The last one I want to touch on here is Sephu's Proclamation. This is very, very similar to Sephu's from Legion. Interrupting a mob, interrupting, I guess, loss of control. Basically, like Mortal Coil, Fear, Shadow Fury, interrupts. Gives you an 80 secondary stat increase for 15 seconds on a 30-second cooldown. This could be a really strong legendary, more so looking at Mythic Plus, but depending on raid fights, it could also be pretty good, looking at like Sun King Salvation with ads, or Stone Legion Generals, or Dance Boss. A handful of them have ads that you can probably see C or Interrupt or Incap or Fear and proc this effect. This is one to keep your eye on for sure. But as far as like crafting order goes, depending what you want to do, your best single target legendary is going to be Cinders of Azakir. I truly feel that way, barring it being nerfed, which I don't think it will be. This is going to be your best single target de facto go-to legendary. If you're looking at Mythic Plus, I think Wilfred's is where you want to be, playing the Reign of Chaos, Inferno, Soul Conduit build. Even playing this build in Mythic Plus, if you're doing it. A shorter Infernal cooldown. Immolation Aura is very, very strong, very, very valuable in Plus because it pulsates on multiple targets. Wilfred's is where you want to be. Also, shout out to Demonic Synergy, not being too bad. My crafting order, if I was going to be playing Destruction, keep in mind that you can't actually get this until Castle Nathria opens in week 3. It drops from Sludge Fist, which is the third to last boss. Would be Wilfred's into Cinders. If you're waiting for raid week, well, it sort of depends what you want to do more. If you're interested more in raiding or Mythic Plus, I think at this point you want to wait for at least Heroic to open, most likely Mythic, in case there's tuning to Legendaries and all that kind of stuff. Cinders is where I would be single target or Castle Nathria based. Wilfred's is where I'd be Mythic Plus, and Synergy, you know, it's a decent middle ground. I will say, if you're playing purely Destro in Castle Nathria, there are a couple fights, which I'll be releasing that video in a few days, probably 5 or 6, where you're going to want to play the Inferno, Soul Conduit, Reign of Chaos build. And there are 4 patchwork bosses this tier, which you'll play Cataclysm and Channel Demon Fire, like with Roaring Blaze most likely. So you end up getting use out of both of these. But if you're looking for one all-around, just generic Destro legendary, and not looking at making multiples for like one spec at a time, Wilfred's is where you want to be. It's not bad single target, it's good AoE, and it just works across every version of Destro. And technically you can use it for Demo and AF too, but it's not very good for them. So single target, Cinders, AoE, heavy Mythic Plus, raid cleave, Wilfred's. Pretty much cut and dry. getting into conduits for destruction here, starting off with the endurance ones. Accrued vitality, I'm not a huge fan of. It's an increase in drain life healing over time. It could be fine in arenas or parts of the game, I guess, where you want a bit of extra drain life healing, but it doesn't heal for much in the first place. I'm not a big fan. Resolute Barrier gives you I guess a CD reduction to an ending resolve. This could be very good at higher eye levels, but as of right now, I'm not a huge fan. It's just subpar in my opinion. Best endurance conduit I feel hands down is Diabolic Bloodstone. Anyone that consumes your health stone infuses you with 10% leech for 6 seconds. That increases based on eye level of Diabolic Bloodstone. This is very, very solid. It's a throwback to Legion's Sweet Souls, I believe, artifact weapon ability that gave you, it healed you whenever something popped a health stone. This is a very strong effect. I will note though that it says your health stone, meaning if there's multiple warlocks in the raid, well, you better be dropping healthstones for your pull, because if they're popping somebody else's, you're not getting the heal. So keep that in mind, boys. But Diabolic Bloodstone, I feel, is our best endurance conduit here. Finesse, Fel, Celerity, whatever this is, I don't know. The cooldown of Feldom is reduced by 54 seconds. It gets higher the higher eye level you have. This is fine. It's good. Once again, Feldom makes your pet basically instant cast and costs no shard. So, I mean, listen. We all hate 6-second pet summons. Fel Domination helps a little bit, and this helps reduce the cooldown, so hey, it's there. Kilrog's Cunning is the one that makes your Kilrog, I have Kilrog no longer stealth, it can place demonic circles. I don't totally understand the idea behind this, because it's no longer stealth, so if the eye can place a circle without pulling a boss, I can probably just run the same route and place the circle without pulling the boss. It does increase the movement speed, which is pretty cool, but for the most part, there might be some niche settings where this is useful. I don't really see them right now. Demonic Momentum, Demonic Circle Teleport increases your movement speed by 30% for 5 seconds. This is actually pretty big. 30% is a lot at rank 1 for this conduit. Typically when you're using your Demonic Circle, you're porting out of areas that are troublesome, places where you're just avoiding mechanics, Mecha Torque knockup, one of 8,000 things. Basically, you can find a use for your Demonic Circle every single fight, and the fact that it increases your movement speed by 30% baseline for 5 seconds is pretty big. That's excessive. This is a good conduit for raiding, for PvE, probably even for PvP too. Shade of Terror, fear effects can withstand more damage. I don't know. We're not fearing things in PvE. So as far as finesse goes, I think it's Demonic Momentum, followed by Fel, Celerity or whatever, Kilrog's Cunning, and Shade of Terror. I'm a big fan of Demonic Momentum. I think it's undervalued right now, and it's going to be really good in progression. Potency conduits. So, starting off with the Destro ones here. Duplicitous Havoc. Havoc transfers 15% more damage. This is fine. It's meant to be played in cleave settings like Mythic Plus, or, you know, raid settings where you can basically cleave on the 2 permanent targets whenever your Havoc comes off cooldown. If you play this with the actual legendary cloak here being Odir, you have a 40% increased damage to your secondary target. Havoc deals, you know, 60% normally. I'm actually playing the conduit. It says 75, but it deals 60. So for the most part, it would say 60 here on the tooltip. So it gives you basically the same damage dealt to your main target as it is your priority target. And this, the actual percent that it transfers scales with a higher eye level. So it's fine. It's solid. It's nothing to really write home about, but it's just going to be good in Havoc-based scenarios for Destro. I'm sort of a fan. Ashen Remains, Chaos Bolt and Incinerate deal 5.6x increased damage to targets affected by Immolate. For the most part, you're going to have anything that you're bolting or incinerating, you're pretty much probably going to have Immolate rolling on. I think this is one of your best, like, all-around conduits for destruction. It's good in plus, it's good in raiding, it's good in AoE, well, decent AoE. It's good in single target. I just am a big fan of Ashen Remains personally. Combusting Engine, this conduit was very, very good, but it was nerfed, essentially by half. Conflict Rate increases your remaining Immolate damage by X% until Immolate expires or is refreshed. So this conduit also gains value with Roaring Blaze and Triple Conflict Rate Legendary, because you have 3 conflags you can put into this, or probably more, depending how many you want to cast, and Roaring Blaze, Immolate damage increase. Now, I will say, this also indeed works with Internal Combustion. I don't want to say that because I hate Internal Combustion, but the good thing is, it still sucks. Well, Internal Combustion still sucks, even with this. So, this conduit has a lot of potential to be abused and broken at a certain point, but as of right now, I don't think it's incredibly OP. If I was going to play a single target conduit, I'd look towards playing Ashen Remains and Combusting Engine. If I was going into like Mythic Plus, for example, I'd probably look towards like Ashen Remains or maybe Duplicitous Havoc and Infernal Brand. Basically, the simplest way I can sort of say where you want to play Infernal Brand, for the most part, if you're playing Reign of Chaos, you probably want to play Infernal Brand. Your Infernal's melee attacks cause your targets to take 2.8% increased damage, X damage, from its immolation aura, the pulsing fire effect that it does, stacking up to 15 times. This conduit has been nerfed by 5 times. The actual way it deals damage has been nerfed or changed as well. This used to be a lot higher. I think it was like 15% baseline, but they've nerfed it over and over and over because it's really hard to balance with Reign of Chaos, because Reign of Chaos has RNG associated with it. This also used to mean that when you had multiple Infernals down for Reign of Chaos and you were hitting one target, every Infernal would give more stacks to that main target. It was all one big debuff, right? And the more Infernals you had rolling, the faster it would reach 15 stacks, 15 times with Infernal Brand. They changed that like a month and a half ago. So each Infernal has its own individual debuff. If I have Reign of Chaos rolling with Infernal Brand and I drop my Infernal, my main Infernal will have a debuff on the target. If I proc a Reign of Chaos Infernal, that Infernal will have a different debuff on the target. So my main one might be at like 7 stacks of increased immolation aura, and the Reign of Chaos one might be at like 2. And each individual Infernal's immolation aura applies to that individual Infernal's stacking debuff. Basically, this conduit, TLDR, is sort of a nightmare. If you're playing Reign of Chaos and AoE, you probably just play Infernal Brand. You can tab target around or change targets when your Infernal is down, and to sort of like swap around immolation aura stacks with your, most of it with your main Infernal, but being able to spread that around once you reach 15 stacks, as long as you're not losing a lot of priority damage, is actually sort of a 5-head play. It's a pretty good idea. So single target wise, I look at playing probably Ashen Remains, Combusting Engine out of these 4. AoE wise, Mythic Plus, I look at playing Reign of Chaos. I look at playing probably Infernal Brand, and then either probably like Ashen Remains or, well, I guess probably Duplicitous Havoc. They're both sort of good in the same, in similar settings, but different settings. You're not, depending on what build you're playing, you're going into your Havoc quite often in Mythic Plus, but you're not necessarily using it for what you're used to. If you're in the Reign of Chaos window, going into your Reign of Havoc, and you're spamming Reign of Fires, you're probably just using it for shard generation and not really pumping out like Chaos Bolts and Incinerates like to a T. 2 target, play Duplicitous Havoc. Big Havoc windows, play Duplicitous Havoc. Play Ashen Remains. Single target, Combusting Engine, Ashen Remains. Heavy AoE, you went Infernal Brand mixed in. It's also worth mentioning that I guess Destro Warlock as a whole has 4 Covenant conduits. Soul Tithe, similar to Destro, or Aff we talked about last night. If a target dies under the effect of Scouring Tithe, the Kyrian one, you gain a 10% increased damage to your Chaos Bolts for 10 seconds. Chaos Bolt hits like a wet noodle. It needs to be buffed. But regardless, it's something. I think there are better options for the most part in the tree here. One cool thing, which we'll talk about in a minute here, is that you can actually Havoc your Scouring Tithe as Kyrian, Destruction Warlock. So if one target, for example, has Scouring Tithe on it, and it dies, you'll get the 5 shards back from Scouring Tithe, or you'll get the 5 shards from it. And if the other target doesn't die before Scouring Tithe essentially expires, it will reset the cooldown. So that's a cool, like, little unique interaction that Destro has with Kyrian and Scouring Tithe. So there's some extra merit added to Soul Tithe there. This is terrible. You don't play it for the most part. It's sad. I love Venthyr. It's sad you don't play it. This is terrible. I love Necrolord. Sad you don't play it. Soul Eater. Soul Rot is a very actual, like, the raw damage that Soul Rot puts out in 3-4 targets, even single target, is actually impressive. If you end up going Night Fae, depending what you're doing, it's more or less going to be a sim thing, but Soul Eater could very well be a potential choice, whether you're in like Mythic Plus or maybe single target, depending on how Ashen Remains and Combusting Engine and things end up shaking out. Certainly worth keeping an eye on Soul Eater and Soul Tithe as a Destro lock. So starting it off with Covenants here, if you're looking at playing Night Fae, the ability, for whatever reason, the ability you get is Soul Rot. It puts a dot on one target and up to 3 other targets nearby, causing him to suffer a decent bit of nature damage over 8 seconds. Now, the important thing to remember here, or to note, is that your primary target, meaning if I attack these 4 and hit this one, your primary target takes double the damage of the surrounding targets that the dot goes on. The other cool part is that for the next 8 seconds, meaning the duration of the actual effect, your casting Drain Life will essentially AoE Drain Life. So it looks pretty cool, right? Unfortunately, Drain Life doesn't get any kind of damage amp from this, and Drain Life's actual damage is just so incredibly undertuned that you don't even bother pressing Drain Life with this ability. It's been a point we've made on beta, through alpha into beta, nothing changed with it. So for Destruction, if you're looking at playing Night Fae, at this point in time, you're basically just taking it for the dot damage, or I guess the priority damage, whatever you're doing, that Soul Rot puts out. Now, pound for pound, Soul Rot is our hardest hitting dot ability, looking at Kyrian, Scouring Tithe, Soul Rot for Night Fae, obviously, and Impending Catastrophe for Venthyr. It is the hardest hitting one. It's also the shortest duration-wise, 8 seconds compared to 12 for Venthyr, and, well, 18 to Perma for Kyrian. But as mentioned, the cool thing about Soul Rot is that it does deal more damage to your priority target, meaning that it has a bit more added value in single target comparatively to like Impending Catastrophe, where it deals the same damage to every target. Or even, I guess you can sort of say, Scouring Tithe. And the cool thing also is that the damage it brings is still pretty relevant in Mythic Plus when you have 3-4 targets and can apply the dot to every target that you hit. Looking at the Soulbinds for actual Night Fae, there are a couple that stick out here. Technically, all 3 have decent abilities, but the big one here is Dreamweaver. You get your second Potency Conduit at Renown 14. Every other Soulbind in the game starts at like level Renown 21, 22, something along those lines. Now, I believe Pelagos early on had 2 early Potency Conduits, and that was changed. I do expect Dreamweaver to change, but I would keep in mind that it might not. And if it doesn't, this is the only Soulbind that of every Covenant you have, they get you your second Potency Conduit for Mythic Castle Nathria opening. Also, her final ability being Field of Blossoms, Soul Rot puts flowers at your feet for 10 seconds. That increases your haste by 12% when you stand in them. It's a pretty solid ability. It's important to keep in mind that these final abilities you probably won't reach until later Renown levels after Nathria is over, depending on how fast your guild progresses. But still, it's there, and it's certainly worth making a point of. To a similar extent, Wild Hunt Tactics. Your damage to targets above 75% health is increased by 10%. So comparatively to another Warlock, barring like Soulbind and Covenant differences, you're going to be doing 10% more damage for the first quarter of a fight. If there's more adds present spawning throughout the fight, like Wild Hunt Tactics is pretty good. This is the very, very first ability that Kyrian, I guess, Kyrian, I don't know, Kyrian, gets here. Night Fae for Destruction is sort of in a weird spot, because we'll get to Kyrian in a bit here. You don't get as much raw value for Destro as you do with, say, Kyrian in 2 target fights, making good use of Havoc, or necessarily even single target, depending on how it goes, if you get shards back or whatever you're doing with your Scouring Tithe. But Night Fae is strong, single target, partially due to it dealing twice the amount of damage to your main target, and also strong in AoE, or I guess stacked AoE, or Mythic Plus. So even though I might not want to be a Night Fae a whole lot, it's still up there on my list of strong Covenants. And also, yeah, by the way, double potency, again, Renown 14. Field of Blossoms and Wild Hunt Tactics are also pretty good. Night Fae is definitely up there in my choice of strong Covenants for Destruction Warlock. Now, if you're looking at playing a Necrolord Destruction Warlock, you get the Decimating Bolt ability. This hurls bolts of magic at your target, dealing shadow damage, and increases the damage of your next 3 incinerates by 100%. Decimating Bolt's damage and the bonus to incinerate both increase as your target's health decreases. So this sort of makes Decimating Bolt a bit of an execute kind of ability. Now, the max damage amp you can get from Decimating Bolt is 160%, essentially when the mob is like 1%. So you're looking anywhere from like 100 to 100 and, I don't know, 50-ish being real here. Now, you might say, oh, incinerate damage. It's actually really cool because Fire and Brimstone is incinerate damage. Unfortunately, if you have if you're a Necrolord and choose Fire and Brimstone, it decreases the amount of damage you get in Decimating Bolt. Look at the tooltip here. It says 100, right? Going to Fire and Brimstone, it now says 40. The value is reduced while using Fire and Brimstone. Now, early on, this is a part of the Necrolord gutting that Blizzard did. The Decimating Bolt damage amp was 200 to 400 baseline, and it didn't have any kind of DRs for Fire and Brimstone. So if you were playing, like the big debate was FMB or Inferno is for Destro and Plus, because Fire and Brimstone gave you a lot of front-loaded damage. Heading into a pack, from the next pack, you'd snipe it with a bolt and go 3 massive incinerates and deal a lot of damage. But then outside of that, Fire and Brimstone was pretty irrelevant. It was extra shards, but the damage wasn't really there. However, that interaction was nerfed tremendously. This Fire and Brimstone Decimating Bolt thing is not really a big deal anymore. But regardless, outside of that, if you're playing the single target build of Cataclysm, Roaring Blaze, CDF, or just anything but Fire and Brimstone, this still does buff 3 incinerates. It still buffs 3 Fire and Brimstones technically, but the big thing here is that Incinerate is fire damage. Roaring Blaze increases Incinerate damage. And once again, we're back to this Roaring Blaze build Destruction that actually makes Necrolord, I feel, Decimating Bolt, a pretty solid choice when you're looking at single target or like 2 target Havoc Cleave fights for Destro locks. If you're looking at Soulbinds or Destro as Necrolord, both Bonesmith and Ameni have interesting abilities. Ameni brings Lead by Example to the table, basically an intellect increase on a 45-second cooldown, because hey, Decimating Bolt is 45 seconds, and also a bit of an increase, you know, based on party size and all that stuff. It's pretty cool. Bonesmith brings Marrow Gemstone. This has moved around a couple of spots. It used to be like here-ish in a different node, but now it's down at the very bottom. After landing 10 critical strikes, you gain 18% increased crit chance, I guess chance to critical strike for 10 seconds. This may only occur once every minute. The cool thing is Chaos Bolt always crits. It is 100% always going to crit. So, and its damage is further increased by your critical strike chance. So if you have Marrow Gemstone proc and dump a handful of Chaos Bolts during that 10-second window, this is a pretty substantial increase for Destruction. It certainly shouldn't be overlooked or undervalued. Marrow Gemstone, even though it's not connected to a potency conduit, is still one of those choices that you've heard about it a bit. This might be better. This might be better, for example, than a second potency. And it might be, depending on how Destro's conduits end up shaking up, single target or 2 target, or whatever you're looking at. I would not overlook Bonesmith if you're playing Necrolord, but also keep in mind that Ameni gets a pretty good effect here at her first node comparatively to Bonesmith in, well, his very last node. Now, if you're looking at playing a Venthyr Destruction Warlock, the ability you get is Impending Catastrophe. Basically, it deals a bit of shadow damage whenever the ability hits the target, and then also puts a dot on surrounding targets or mobs that it actually hits. In addition to doing that, it also applies either Curse of Weakness or Curse of Recklessness. Now, this ability is indeed Smart Curse, and you can see it has weakness on a target here that has no mana bar. It'll put tongues on casters. For a while, it wasn't doing that. So that change does indeed add a bit of value to this ability and make it a bit more relevant. This ability is more AoE focused because it's not target cap, meaning technically if you do a really large pull and plus, this could apply a dot to every target that it hits. The unfortunate thing is that Impending Catastrophe was nerfed. The actual impact damage was nerfed by 80%, and the dot that it applies, well, that was nerfed by, I believe, 40 or 50% a few months ago. So this ability is I wouldn't say much better. It's better for sure in Mythic Plus, stacked AoE, things like that. If you're looking at playing, you know, Mythic Plus is a Destro Warlock and really look like Venthyr, then hey, you're not technically in a bad spot. But if you're looking for like a single target ability to come out of Venthyr, Impending Catastrophe is not where you want to be, unfortunately. It is just really undertuned at this current point in time, and it's just not very well balanced as a whole. Looking at the Soulbinds from Venthyr, unfortunately, once again, similar to how Affliction is, there really aren't a lot of amazing choices. You have Nagia, I guess, for Thrillseeker, and there are a few like DPS abilities sprinkled in here and there, like interrupting an enemy or dispelling an ally gives you 10% increased crit, but there's nothing really to write home about, you know, similar to like the Night Fae ability or just other more impactful damage-based abilities that other Covenants have. So as much as I like Venthyr, it's either that or Necrolord being my favorite Covenant, they're just not really in a great spot for Destro Warlocks. A bit better in plus and stacked AoE, but honestly, Destro already brings a lot of that to Mythic Plus with your Reign of Chaos, Wilfrid's, Inferno, Soul Conduit build. I'm not very high, unfortunately, on Venthyr, currently, at this point, in Shadowlands. So, when you're looking at Kyrian Warlocks, the ability that you get is Scouring Tide. It deals X arcane damage instantly and puts a dot on the target for 18 seconds. Targets, but we'll get to that. If the enemy dies while affected by Scouring Tide, the dot, you generate 5 soul shards. If the target doesn't die, basically, if it survives and the dot expires itself, the cooldown is actually refreshed. So it goes from a 40-second CD to a basically 18-second one if the target doesn't die. This is a very strong effect for Destro locks, mainly because the cool thing here is that you can put Havoc on one target and Scouring Tithe a different one, and check this out. Both targets have Scouring Tithe on them. And the really cool thing here is that, let's say I dump my shards, if this target here dies with Scouring Tithe on it, I'll get 5 shards back. But if this one lives, the cooldown will be reset, which you'll see in about 2 seconds here, right in my bars, right about now. There you go. It's really cool, and I think increases the skill ceiling of playing Kyrian Destro with Havoc on a lot of fights by a substantial bit. If you're looking at actual Soulbinds here, it's Pelagos. Pelagos is still really good. The first ability, Combat Meditation. Mastery proc, you saw the Orb proc there. Mastery is good for Destro, which is good in general. It's a good solid effect. For the most part, Clea and Forge Light, they're not just as strong as Pelagos. Pelagos is where you want to be, even after the change to let go of the past. Yes, this is made post-nerfs, just like the Affliction guide. Kyrian Warlock, as far as Destro is concerned, in my opinion, is where you want to be. Scouring Tithe, being able to be Havoc, the shard generation you get back, the dot damage it deals on 2 targets, the fact that it lines up pretty well for the most part with your Havoc cooldown, and which is what Pelagos brings to the table, makes, in my opinion, Kyrian the choice for Destro Warlocks overall. So, if we're talking about Covenant rankings for Destro locks, number 1, just like Affliction, I'm going to give to Kyrian. The Mastery Combat Meditation buff that Pelagos brings early on, and just what Kyrian can do with Havoc, Scouring Tithe, the shard generation, or the reset of its cooldown, and the actual Havoc play you have with it on different targets dying at different times, is really strong for Destro and just brings a lot to its overall toolkit. Number 2 is close. It's close between Night Fae and Necrolord. I'm going to say, though, I give it to Necrolord. It's very, very close. The actual buff to incinerate damage, how it interacts with Roaring Blaze and Triple Conflict Legendary and Conflagrate and just Flash Over, there's a lot of synergy there. And even though it was nerfed a decent bit, it's still solid. Now, it might not be necessarily as good as like Soul Rot will be in Mythic Plus for Night Fae, but I think looking at both sides, like Mythic Plus versus single target for Night Fae comparatively to Necrolord, I think looking at them both, even with Fire and Brimstone being nerfed as well, Necrolord is just a tiny, tiny bit better in rating. I feel that's also in 2-target cleave with Havoc, which is what Destro is about. I think it pulls ahead a tiny bit. Number 3, I spoiled it a little bit, but Night Fae. Soul Rot is fine damage, single target. It's solid damage, AoE and plus. It doesn't really interact with the toolkit in any way, like it does for Affliction, having Inevitable Demise. You're not even pressing Drain Life when the ability is active, but it's there. It's an ability you can hit every minute or so, sort of set it and forget it for a bit of extra value. It's not bad. Oh, and the Soulbinds, well, you know, Renown 14, double potency. Not the worst either. Number 4, once again, unfortunately, is Venthyr. I want Venthyr to be good. I like Venthyr. I like Necrolords. But in the end, I see what's nerfed too much. It is very, very bad single target at this point in time. I'm not even really sure it's worth pressing single target. When we ran a key on live, or on beta, a couple keys, even as Affliction, where you get a bit more value, or it's with your Dark Lair extensions, the actual dot damage was so incredibly underwhelming. Even in AoE in Mythic Plus, I just don't have a whole lot of hope for Venthyr right now in its current form. Also, the Soulbinds aren't really anything to write home about. Now, hopefully it's buffed to a certain extent, and then Venthyr becomes, you know, a solid choice again. But then you're getting in the territory of buffing Covenants after release, and people have chosen their Covenants, and that is a nightmare in itself. So, number 1, Kyrian. Number 2, Necrolord. Number 3, Night Fae. Number 4, Venthyr. So, if you're looking at Destruction's single target rotation, for the most part, playing Roaring Blaze, CDF, Cataclysm, Entropy, and Flashover, we're also playing Triple Conflict here. It more or less revolves around just min-maxing your Roaring Blaze windows. But the cool thing is, playing as Legendary, your entire rotation is pretty much a Roaring Blaze window. There might be a certain point in time, looking at my actual Conflict Rate cooldown here, being 8.5 seconds, where Conflict Rate or Roaring Blaze is down for a few seconds. But you can just dump Chaos Bolts during that for the most part. Now, you have Scouring Tithe here. I'm not going to really work in a class ability or a Covenant ability, because it depends on what Covenant you're playing. For the most part, work it in where you want, while being optimal. And I will say, once again, Destro can have a Scouring Tithe, so if you have a target spawning or an ad spawning, you know, pretty quickly into the fight or whatever, probably worth holding it for your Havoc window at that point. But regardless, let's get into this. So normally what I'll do, I'll open up by precasting an actual Incinerate travel time into Cataclysm, drop my Inferno, it's not keybound, and go right into a Conflict Rate, Channel Demon Fire. Now looking at my shards here, I'm going to dump 2 Bolt after this, so I don't want a shard cap. Bolt, a Conflict Rate, dump a couple Incinerates, Bolt again, and look at Roaring Blaze. This is my Roaring Blaze tracker. You can also see it here. For the most part, you're just min-maxing around, like casting your fire spells while you have Roaring Blaze up. We just refresh there. We'll Bolt again, go into CDF. You could have popped Zerking too, but hey, I sort of forgot. And watching your backdraft stacks, watching Roaring Blaze, just min-maxing around it. Dump another Bolt here. Kata's off CD. We'll Cataclysm again. Double Conflag. Roaring dropping there. Clip it right before it expires. Into a Bolt. We'll Incinerate once here. Conflict Rate into a CDF. Honestly, I'll Incinerate a couple times here. Incinerate, Conflict Rate. One more. Dump a Bolt. Refresh ammo. It's falling. Conflict Rate again. That's pretty much it. You just min-max around casting your fire spells, being your other Conflict Rates, your Incinerates, technically your Immolates if you really want, and your Channel Demon Fires, while you have your Roaring Blaze active, which is once again applied by Conflict Rate. Now there's going to be times where you're bolting during your Roaring Blaze window. It's going to happen quite often. That's fine, as long as you're min-maxing your fire spells, as long as you're not, you know, wasting time bolting in a Roaring Blaze window when, for example, you might be holding your Conflag for a second or two, in I don't know, a few seconds, depending on CDs and things. But for the most part, playing this legendary gives you such an insane amount of leeway, even if you mess up 1 or 2 things in your rotation single target, because you pretty much have Roaring Blaze active the whole time, as long as you play decently with it and clip before it falls. It's really pretty simple. Be sure to cast Conflict Rate off cooldown, even if your ammo is not in pandemic range. Besides that, you're pretty much good to go. If you're looking at Destro's Reign of Chaos, Soul Conduit, Inferno, basically the AoE Mythic Plus rotation with Wilfred's attached to it, things are a little different. You don't have Cataclysm anymore. You don't have Channel Demon Fire anymore. So for the most part, when it comes to Mythic Plus, this is the opener you want to follow. If a tank is running in, I'll get my Immolates rolling. You know, 1, 2, depending how many pack or mobs there are. 1, 2, we'll roll 4, for an example here. And basically go right into dropping our Infernal. I'll Conflag, I'll Rain of Fire off the start, I'll put up my Havoc, more Shard Gen, I'll Conflag, and basically just cast spells here, generate resources. Immolates, Conflags, Incinerates, whatever. I'll pop my Zerking. Your main thing is just trying to cast as many spells to generate as many resources as possible, so you can just cast as many Rain of Fires as possible for as many Infernal procs as possible. More Infernals, more Shard Gen, more Immolation Aura value, more Infernal Brand Conduit value, more Rain of Fire cast, and it gives you a really strong AoE damage profile. Now, the big thing with this actual profile as well, and you can have your Scouring Tithe here also. I didn't do it just for, you know, showing extra shard generation and things. The big thing with this damage profile is that if you get lucky, RNG is RNG. It's sort of like VOP is in BFA. If you get lucky early on and proc an Infernal off your very first shard consuming spell, basically if you go like Infernal right into Rain of Fire and proc an Infernal off that, that's more shard gen early on, which fuels more Rain of Fire cast early on, and it just snowballs from there. Now, Reign of Chaos, like I said, brings a really, really strong damage profile. It is indeed attached to your Infernal, however, but you can see, like, our Infernal is off CD in basically a minute or so here already, due to the power of Wilfred's, Soul Conduit, Reign of Chaos, Rain of Fire spam. It's a really, really strong build and brings a really strong damage profile in Mythic Plus. If your tank is pulling larger packs, none of this is AoE capped. Rain of Fire is not, Immolation Aura is not, nothing is capped here. If your tank is pulling around your CDs and makes like a double pull or a really large pull here, and you can get most of your value out of your Reign of Chaos window with all the Rain of Fire value that you get as well, no one's really going to be able to touch your damage. The damage you put out is truly insane. The problem with this, though, is that outside of that window, you don't deal a tremendous amount of damage, and it just feels a tiny bit lackluster. Let's take a brief look at the Cataclysm CDF build I talked about earlier in the AoE talent section in Mythic Plus. So this build, like I mentioned earlier, is not as CD-centric, I suppose, or I guess Infernal-centric. Technically, CDF and Cataclysm are CDs, but you get what I'm saying. So the big thing here is that you're playing Cataclysm over Inferno, and you're playing Channel Demon Fire over Soul Conduit. Now, Cataclysm is a 30-second CD. Channel Demon Fire is a 21, technically second CD, depending on haste. But the big thing here is that heading into a pack, unlike Reign of Chaos, Soul Conduit, Rain of Fire build, Cataclysm applies to Immolate to all targets. So you can go in, instead of going Immo 4 times, you go Kata for that impact damage when Kata lands and 4 Immolates rolling. And then basically you go right into a Channel Demon Fire, into a Havoc, into your Infernal, and go from there. So if I'm heading into a pack, tanks pulling, Cataclysm, normally I'll drop my Infernal, go CDF into Rain of Fire, pop my Zerking, Havoc. If we're gonna Scouring Tide, we can do it here. It's fine. And then for the most part, like, I'm just building resources here, building shards here, Havocing, Conflict Rates, Incinerates, whatever, and just casting Rain of Fire. So my Infernal is still down. Like, we're still generating resources here. It's just, it's not as, like, it's not as strong of a CD, but it's still there. The Immolation Aura is still valuable. It's still relevant. We'll refresh our MOs if we have to, if the pack lives long enough. Kata's off CD now, so technically we'll just Kata again. Cast a Rain of Fire again here. Havoc's coming off CD. Scouring Tide's there too. Put up our Havoc again. Go back to a Scouring Tide. Cast another Rain of Fire. And look, we have Channel Demon Fire up again. And Channel Demon Fire also cleaves into everything. So, obviously, you wait till your Havoc drop, but you know what I'm getting at here. So, for the most part, this gives you a much more sustainable damage profile. The ceiling is not as high as Reign of Chaos, but you have Kata every half a minute. You have CDF every 20 seconds. And you don't have that semi-sustainable cleave with the Reign of Chaos build. This build, I feel, is a bit more universal in plus if you're not in an organized group, or your tank's not pulling around your Infernal, or you're in like a mid-tier key where you're not looking at like these packs lasting half a minute where your Infernal will get most value most of the time. This is probably not going to be like the mainstay build. You're probably going to see Reign of Chaos, you know, Soul Conduit, Inferno more, but this is a solid alternative if you don't like that playstyle. Thanks for watching, dudes. I hope this video gave you all a better understanding, just grasp on really how and what Destruction Warlock is heading into Shadowlands as a whole. Castle Nathria looks pretty good for Destruction Warlocks. I can safely say that whether you're playing Destruction or Affliction, we've made that comparison a couple of times over the course of this video. I feel that you can pretty much get away with playing full Destro or full Demo in Nathria. Some fights are more tailored towards Destruction, like Sun King Salvation, maybe Stone Legion Generals, but the spec is good enough, I feel, that you can pretty much get away with playing it in every scenario. I can't really say the same for Demonology, but we'll get to that in the next guide coming out in a day or two. Once again, any Weak ORS profiles add-ons you see here are indeed available on my Twitch. If you want to swing by, grab them, ask any questions anytime, feel free to do so. Let me know what you guys think of this, I guess, these versions, these builds of Destro, this version of Destruction in Shadowlands in the comment section below. If you have any questions, drop them down there as well. I'll be sure to get back to you. If you guys want to see more WoW content or see that Demonology guide, or technically the AF one that I put out a couple days ago, feel free to hit the subscribe button below and hit the like button while you're down there. Thanks again, dudes, and I'll catch you all again soon. Peace.